I found a letter from my mom that revealed hidden siblings and a dark family truth, Reddit stories. I wasn't looking for anything when I found it. Not really. It was one of those late summer afternoons when the air in the house feels too still, and you start cleaning just to move something, anything. My mother had died 4 weeks earlier, and I was sorting through her things alone in the house we'd both grown up in. Her as a daughter, me as a reluctant heir to her silence. It wasn't grief that drove me to open every drawer and box and cupboard that day. It was something quieter. A throb. A question I hadn't dared ask until she was gone. Who were you, really? She was a neat woman, my mother. Everything folded. Everything labeled. Even the drawers in her nightstand were arranged like a museum exhibit. Nail scissors, lip balm, a rosary she hadn't touched since 2002. I almost didn't notice the envelope. It was slipped beneath the drawer lining like it had crawled there to die in peace. No name, no stamp, just a yellowing envelope with, "For her," written in my mother's small, almost apologetic handwriting. It was sealed, but not tightly. I sat on her bed, the one with the rose, embroidered quilt and the faint scent of lavender, and opened it with hands that weren't ready. Inside was a letter, just 4 pages. Written in the same neat script, no greeting, no dear, anything, just a date, March 18, 1993, and a line that knocked the wind from my chest before I even read the rest. I'm sorry for what I had to do. The words unraveled from there, one after another like stitches pulled from a wound too old to bleed. It was addressed not to me, but to someone named Elise. My name is Anna. I read it once, then again, then a third time. The letter spoke of a child. A first child, one my mother had given birth to when she was only 17. Sent away to a convent outside the city, the kind of place girls in trouble were sent back then. She named the baby Elise, but she never held her, wasn't allowed to. A nurse whispered the name back to her, and that was it. The baby was taken. She came back home and never spoke of it again. Until now. In the letter, she said she thought about Elise every day. That not a birthday passed without her wondering where she was, if she was loved, if she looked like her. She wrote that she had tried to find her once, years later, but was told the records had been sealed. That it would be better for everyone if the past stayed buried. But then came the part that stopped everything. I saw her once, I'm sure of it. She was at the grocery store. 22, maybe. Brown hair like mine. Holding a little boy's hand. I knew. A mother knows. She didn't say if she spoke to her. Only that she stood there, frozen in the produce aisle, watching a ghost walk away in jeans and a windbreaker. Watching a life that had been erased still moving, breathing, shopping for apples. When I finally moved, it wasn't to cry. It was to find more. Anything. Another letter. A photograph. A name, but there was nothing. Just that one envelope, sealed and hidden like a heart tucked inside a drawer. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of a house that had held too many secrets for too long. My mother had never been cruel, but she had been distant. Kind in that restrained, mid-century way that made you feel like you were always being hosted, not raised. I thought I'd made peace with that. But this letter cracked something open. A life I never knew she had. A daughter I never knew existed. A sister. I told no one. Not at first. The next morning, I drove to the convent. It had been converted into a retreat center now, the kind with brochures about mindfulness and silent weekends. I didn't have an appointment. I just showed up, the letter folded in my jacket pocket like it might grant me entry into the past. The receptionist, a woman named Sister Clara, looked at me over thin glasses. "We don't keep records from that far back," she said. But I could tell she was lying, or at least hiding something. I showed her the letter. She read it silently, lips barely moving, then looked up at me with something between pity and alarm. "I'll see what I can find," she said. "Wait here." I waited for an hour. The lobby smelled like lemon polish and old wood. People walked by in soft shoes, whispering about God and forgiveness. When Sister Clara returned, she was holding a thin folder. She didn't hand it to me, just said, "We're not supposed to release anything, but sometimes the heart knows what's right." Inside the folder was a birth certificate, Elise Mary Caldwell, born March 17, 1973. Mother Jane Caldwell. No father listed. A note in the corner, adopted April 3, 1973, finalized by court order. The adoptive parents' names had been redacted. That was it, but it was enough. I had a full name, a birthday, a thread. Back home, I dug into everything I could find. Online records, ancestry sites, obituaries. The trail was slow. Elise Caldwell was a common enough name, and adoption records were sealed like vaults. But then, 3 days later, I found it. A wedding announcement from 1998. Elise Caldwell married a man named Brian Holt in our city. A small ceremony, local church. Her photo was there. It was like looking into a mirror tilted by time. She had my mother's jaw, her eyes, her posture. She lived 2 towns over, had 2 children, and ran a bakery. I sat with that knowledge like it was radioactive. I didn't know what I wanted. To meet her, to tell her who I was, to share the letter and say, "Hey, our mother loved you." She never forgot. But what if she didn't want that? What if she didn't know she was adopted? Or worse, what if she did, but didn't care? What if I shattered her life the way mine had been shaken? I waited another week. Then 2, I told my husband. He listened carefully, like he always did, and said only this: "Oh, you'll know when it's time." Not really. But I went anyway. I drove to the bakery on a Tuesday, mid-morning. The shop smelled like cinnamon and warm bread. There were 3 customers ahead of me. I scanned the staff. 2 girls in aprons, laughing. An older man behind the register. And then her. She walked out of the back carrying a tray of croissants. And for a moment, just one, I felt like a child again, watching my mother in the kitchen, the way she'd hum when she thought no one was listening. I didn't speak to her. I left. Cowardly? Maybe. But something told me it wasn't the right moment. I came back the next week. Same time. She was there again. This time I stayed. Ordered a coffee. Sat by the window. Watched her talk to customers, smile, wipe her hands on a towel looped through her apron. Watched her live. And then, somehow, our eyes met. She paused, just for a second. A flicker. Recognition. She looked away. I left again. That night, I took out the letter and read it one last time. Then I sealed it in a new envelope. With it, I included a note of my own. Just a few lines, not an explanation, not a demand, just an offering. I think we may be connected. I have something that belonged to your mother. If you ever want to meet, I'll be here. Anna. I dropped it off at the bakery the next morning, left it with the man at the counter, didn't wait to see if she came out. And now I wait. Maybe she'll call. Maybe she won't. But the letter's out in the world now. And so is the truth. And sometimes that's all you can do. Let the past breathe. And see if it comes back. It was 12 days after I left the letter at her bakery when the call finally came. I was standing in the kitchen, ankle deep in grocery bags, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I just stared at it. There was no reason to expect it was her. And yet, somewhere in the hollow of my ribs, I knew. The air changed. Everything went still, like the house itself was holding its breath. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and answered with a voice I didn't recognize as my own. "Hello." A silence. Then a breath. Then, "Is this Anna?" My stomach clenched so fast I felt lightheaded. "Wes," I said. "This is Elise." Just like that, no preamble, no small talk, just the name. And it didn't sound like a stranger saying it. It sounded like someone testing the weight of their own reflection. I couldn't speak for a second. I didn't want to say the wrong thing, didn't want to rush, didn't want to ruin this fragile bridge stretching across decades and secrets and guilt. "I got your letter," she said softly. "I read it more than once." I sat down on the stool beside the counter because my legs felt suddenly foreign. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I should," she said. I've had suspicions. My whole life, really, but suspicions are easier to bury than answers, then silence. But it wasn't cold, just tired. We sat with it together, each of us turning it over, trying to see if this conversation could hold what we needed it to. Eventually, she said, "I don't know what I want from this." "I don't either," I admitted, "but I think we should meet." A long pause. "I'm not ready," she said, "but I have questions, and I don't want to ask them over the phone." "Then, can you come tomorrow, after closing?" I was already nodding before she finished. "Yes, of course." "Good. There's a side door near the alley." Knock twice. Click. No goodbye. But somehow it wasn't abrupt. It felt like punctuation, a period at the end of a sentence that had been waiting 30 years to be written. I barely slept that night. My thoughts kept looping her voice, the way she said my name like it belonged to someone she used to know, the way she didn't ask for proof or details or reassurance, just presence. The next evening, the streets were wet with rain that hadn't fully committed to falling. The bakery's lights were off, its chairs flipped on tables. I knocked twice on the side door, like she said. A second later, it opened. She stood there in a flour-dusted apron, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back. She looked nothing like me and yet everything like my mother. The same narrow eyes, the same angle of the jaw when she was bracing for something. "Come in," she said. Inside, the bakery was dim and warm. The smell of butter and vanilla still hung in the air. She led me through the kitchen to a small office in the back. There were 2 chairs. She pointed to one and took the other. Neither of us spoke at first. It wasn't awkward. It was sacred, like entering a church made of memories neither of us fully owned. "I've had this feeling for years," she said finally. Like something was missing. Something big. My parents were good people. They raised me well. But they always dodged questions about before. I found the adoption certificate once when I was 14. They swore they would tell me more when I was older. They never did. "I'm sorry," I said. She shook her head. "I'm not blaming them. I always felt like a guest in my own life. I wanted answers, but I was afraid they'd change everything." She looked at me, really looked. "And then you walked into my bakery, twice." I smiled faintly. I couldn't bring myself to speak. I knew something was off. "You didn't look lost. You looked like you belonged." That word hit harder than I expected. She reached into a drawer and pulled out the letter I'd left. It was worn at the creases, like it had been opened and folded many times. "Is it true?" she asked. Did she really see me in a grocery store? "Wes," I said, "she never forgot you. She never stopped wondering." I don't think she ever forgave herself. Elise looked down at the letter, blinking fast. "I always hated my birthday," she whispered. March 17th. I didn't know why. I just felt wrong, like a day that was meant for someone else. "She wrote that date everywhere," I said. "Inside her cookbooks, in the margins of calendars." She never said why. Elise put the letter down. "I wish she'd found me," she said. "I wish I'd met her." "She was afraid," I said. "Of what it would do to you, of what it said about her. But she didn't need to be," she said quietly. I would have forgiven her. We sat in silence for a long time after that. Then, as if remembering something buried beneath the rest, she said, "There's something you should see." She got up, unlocked a cabinet behind her, and pulled out a small cardboard box. It was old, the flaps soft at the edges. Inside were photographs, baby pictures, toddler years, school portraits. "She never had any of these," I said. "I didn't know they mattered to anyone but me," Elise said. Then she pulled out something else, a ribbon, faded pink. "This was in the envelope when I was adopted," she said. "No name, no note, just this?" My breath caught. "I've seen that before," I said. She kept its twin in her jewelry box. Same frayed edge. We didn't cry. Not then. But we both held that ribbon like it was a piece of our own history finally handed back. "Do you have any photos of her?" she asked. "I do," I said. "Want me to bring them next time?" She nodded. "Next time," she repeated. I left the bakery that night feeling hollow and whole at once. Like I'd been excavated, but in the best way. The next morning, I brought an album. Photos of Mom through the years, some posed, some candid. Elise flipped through them slowly, like she was trying to memorize a language she was supposed to have been born speaking. "She looks happy here," she said, touching a picture from 2004. She was. That was the first Christmas she let us use paper plates instead of china. Elise smiled. She told me about her childhood, her family, her kids. I told her about Mom, her routines, her quirks, the way she always cut sandwiches diagonally. "Funny," Elise said. "I do that too. Always have." By the third visit, we were laughing. By the fourth, we were finishing each other's sentences. By the fifth, I knew the names of her sons, their favorite cartoons, her dog's weird habit of sneezing when excited. But it wasn't perfect. One afternoon, after a long shift and too many shared cookies, she said, "Sometimes I'm angry at her." "I know," I said. "She gave me away. Even if it wasn't her choices, she let it happen." "She was a scared teenager," I said. "She wasn't allowed to hold you. Her parents sent her away. She told me once she woke up after the delivery and you were already gone." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Still hurts," she said. "I think it always will," I replied. And then she said something that changed everything. "There might be more." I looked at her. "More what?" "More letters. More children." My mouth went dry. I found a name scribbled in the back of one of the old photo albums my adoptive mom gave me. Caldwell. Margaret. It didn't mean anything to me until now. I stared. That was our grandmother's name. "She underlined it," Elise said. 3 times. Like she didn't want to forget, but I stood up slowly. "You think she was trying to leave a trail?" Elise nodded, and just like that the ground beneath us shifted. Again. Because maybe Mom hadn't just left behind a letter. Maybe she left behind a whole story we hadn't even begun to understand, and we were only on page 1. It was a rainy Thursday when we opened the box again. Elise brought it to my apartment in the same grocery bag she used to carry loaves of bread, as if it weren't holding the weight of something that could reshape our bloodlines. Inside were her old adoption papers, hospital forms, and that photo album. Faded green leather, edges frayed, spine cracked. We spread everything across the kitchen table, the air thick with anticipation, like whatever we were about to discover had been waiting patiently for 30 years. She turned to the last page. Tucked behind the sleeve of her second, grade portrait, folded like a secret, was a torn corner of notebook paper with a single line written in blue ink. Caldwell. Margaret, 3 times underlined. Our grandmother. We stared at the name like it might blink back at us. "She was your mom's mother?" Elise asked. I nodded. "Yes, she died when I was 12. I barely remember her. She was always cold. Elegant in a rigid way. You couldn't hug her. You sort of bounced off." "She gave me away," Elise said. Not bitter, just stating it aloud as if the words had been stored in her throat too long. I didn't reply. There wasn't anything I could say to fix the past, but something about the underlined name felt like a whisper trying to become a scream. "What if Margaret didn't just give you away?" I said slowly. "What if there's more?" Elise raised an eyebrow. "You mean, more children?" "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe something happened to make her write her own name down. Maybe she was trying to say something without actually saying it." We stared at the paper in silence. The next morning, I called the archives department at St. Augustine's Catholic Hospital. It was the same place where my mother was born, and also, according to Elise's birth certificate, the same place Elise was delivered 17 years later. The records clerk was polite but guarded. Most of the files from the 1970s and early 1990s were off-site and restricted, especially for cases involving unwed mothers or sealed adoptions. But after some hesitant explaining, she agreed to let us search in person. We arrived 2 days later, armed with copies of both our birth certificates and that scrap of paper with our grandmother's name. The clerk, A woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a librarian's hush led us to a records room that smelled like old glue and humid paper. There were drawers that groaned when opened, folders too thick for their labels, and boxes stacked to the ceiling with decades of forgotten stories. "Start with the Caldwell file," she said. "If it's there, it'll be under maternal records." We opened the drawer. There it was. Margaret Caldwell, admitting records, 1963–1975. I opened the file with shaking hands. Inside were admission logs, billing receipts, a few typed summaries of hospital stays. Most were routine checkups, a gallbladder removal, pneumonia. But one stood out. May 4th, 1965, admitted under alias Mary Cannell, no insurance. Discharge notes, recovery satisfactory. Infant transferred immediately to Holy Family Children's Home. No maternal contact. I handed it to once. Then again. 1965, she said. 8 years before I was born. And under an alias? Which means your mom may not have been her only secret, I said quietly. We checked Holy Family Children's Home next. It had closed in 1999, but the county office had microfilmed most of the records. The clerk there was less sympathetic, but when we showed her both our IDs and the original admission note from the hospital, she led us into a room full of old filing cabinets with a warning, "You get 2 hours. Nothing leaves this room." We found it after an hour and 17 minutes. Cannell, Mary, male infant, May 6, 1965, name given Thomas, no lapse name, no adoption finalization date, just the word, IPLHED. Elise looked at me. Thomas? A brother, older than both of us. What happened to him? She asked. I flipped the card over. In tiny type at the bottom, transferred to Sacred Heart Boys Home, March 1978. Another home, another place. Another dead end? Not quite, because Sacred Heart was still operating, barely. It had become a halfway house for aging residents and young men aging out of the foster system. Elise insisted we go. I hesitated. Are we really ready to meet another sibling? I asked. We haven't even figured us out yet. She looked at me, eyes hard. He didn't ask for this either. So we drove. 2 hours of gray sky and endless cornfields, arriving at a crumbling brick building with vines swallowing the lower windows. A nun named Sister Marie met us at the door. She didn't smile, but there was warmth in her eyes. We're looking for someone, Elise said. Thomas, born 1965, transferred here in 1978? Sister Marie nodded slowly. Thomas, yes, we remember him. I held my breath. Is he here? No, she said gently. He left years ago, but he visits. My heart skipped. She went to a cabinet, pulled out a Wernmela folder labeled T.O. Mass, Russadient File 1978-1983. Inside were school reports, incident logs, some grainy black and white photos. He was tall, thin, sharp eyes. He looked like my grandfather, like Elise. At the back of the folder, tucked behind a report card, was an address, scribbled in blue ink. If he ever comes back. Forward mail here. An apartment in Chicago. We left the home with the address and a photo. Elise held the picture the whole drive back. He looks like us, she whispered. The next day, she called the building's landlord. Posed as someone confirming delivery. Got a unit number. We didn't overthink it. We just drove. Together, the building was plain. 3 floors. Old brick windows fogged with grime. Elise knocked on 2B. We waited, a shuffle inside. Then the door opened, and there he was. Older now, of course. 58 maybe. A salt and pepper beard, thick sweater. Eyes that froze when they landed on us, and then slowly widened. Thomas, Elise asked. He stared, and then said something I'll never forget. You're her, aren't you? Jane's daughter. Elise stepped back. You knew her? I knew of her. Margaret told me when I was 16. Said I had a sister, maybe 2. Said I shouldn't look. He looked at me. And you? I'm her daughter too, I said. Anna. He opened the door wider, and we walked into our brother's apartment. Photos lined the mantel, none of us in them. He had no children, never married. He said he'd always felt like something was missing, but couldn't name it. Said he thought maybe he was just broken. But now, you're not broken, Elise said. You were stolen. We told him everything about the letter, about Mom, about the ribbon, the bakery, the hospital records. He told us about Margaret, how she came to visit once when he was 17. Gave him a watch, said he'd been a necessary mistake. Told him not to call her again. I hated her for years, he said. But now I wonder what she was protecting me from. As we sat together, siblings who had never shared a childhood, never fought over cereal or bike turns or the TV remote, something strange happened. We laughed. We cried. We belonged. Not perfectly. Not seamlessly. But undeniably. And as Elise reached into her bag to show him the ribbon, I realized that scrap of fabric, worn and frayed and barely holding together, had done something no one else could. It had sewn us back into a family, stitch by stitch, story by story. And there, in that small Chicago apartment, 3 children once scattered by shame, sacred silence, and silence sat side by side, whole at last. But even then, we couldn't shake the feeling. There was still more. Because families built on silence don't have just one secret. They have generations of them. And someone, somewhere, still wasn't done talking. Titla. She had another daughter, and she never told anyone. After we found Thomas, everything shifted. The silence that had once felt like protection now rang hollow, like the walls of an empty house. Elise and I returned home dazed and wordless. The 3-hour drive spent trading fragments of memory like puzzle pieces we weren't quite sure how to fit together. Thomas. A brother. Another life veiled by our grandmother's neat handwriting and our mother's aching silence. But even as the shock settled into something steadier, something almost like kinship, I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't finished. That Margaret Caldwell had left more behind than names and warnings. The idea of another came not from a document or a letter this time, but a memory. A strange, bitter thread tugging from the back of my mind. It came to me 2 nights after our visit with Thomas, as I sat flipping through one of my mother's oldest photo albums. One of the few she'd let me touch as a child. I'd looked at it hundreds of times before, but never with this lens. And somewhere between a photograph of my mother at 16 in her school uniform and one of her wedding day with my father, I noticed something I'd always dismissed. A blurry image of 2 girls, arms looped around each other's shoulders, standing outside a hospital entrance. My mother was unmistakable. The other girl wasn't. She looked older, same dark hair, same eyes. But not Margaret, not a school friend either, something deeper. Their body language was intimate, protective. But there was no caption, no date. Just a photo slipped between memories like a heartbeat someone forgot to bury. I showed it to Elise the next morning. She stared at it for a long time before speaking. Who's that? I don't know, I said. But I think she's related. Look at her eyes. We both leaned in. Those eyes. Then Elise said, didn't the hospital records mention another admission in 1980? She was right. We had read it briefly, back when we were too focused on Margaret's alias and Elise's adoption. But there had been another line, a hospital entry, not for Margaret, but for Jane, our mother. March 1980, admitted obstetrics. Outcome confidential. We had brushed past it at the time, assuming it was a miscarriage. But now it held weight. 1980, Elise said. She would have been 24, bah, old enough. Young enough. I called the hospital. This time I gave them my mother's full name and date of birth, told them I was next of kin, asked about March 1980. The clerk was polite, sympathetic. Then she hesitated. There is an admission, she said, but the records air sealed. Unusual for obstetrics. Usually that only happens when. She cut herself off. When? I asked. When adoption is involved. Well, Elise was beside me, gripping the photo. We went back to St. Augustine's. It took a full week of calls, emails, and in-person visits. The clerk who had once helped us was hesitant now. Policies, legal risks. But in the end, perhaps swayed by the fact that our mother was dead and the truth was decades buried. She led us to a smaller records room with a single folder, Jane Caldwell, March 1980, confidential inside, a single page. Live birth, female infant. March 19, 1980. No name given. Transferred immediately to private adoption agency. Mother declined contact. Elise stared at the page, jaw locked. She had another baby. We copied the record, took down the name of the agency, Silver Pines Adoption Services. It no longer existed. Closed in 1995 after a string of financial scandals. The state had absorbed its records. 3 more days of navigating bureaucracy, uncooperative clerks, and dead-end transfers led us to a dusty county archive room. There, in a box labeled Silver Pines 1980 finalized cases, was a list of adoptions. Most were blacked out. But one stood out: baby girl Caldwell, adopted April 7, 1980, adoptive parents Carol and Joseph Whittaker, final name Lydia Whittaker. We stared at the name like it was a candle in the dark. Elise whispered it first. Lydia. I repeated. She'd be 43 now. A quick search revealed nothing concrete. No social media, no business listings. But then Elise tried something clever. She searched for the adoptive parents instead, Carol and Joseph Whittaker. Found an obituary for Carol from 5 years earlier. It listed Lydia as a surviving daughter and listed her married name, Lydia Hayes. Lives in Ohio. 2 children, works in education. She existed. Another sister. We didn't rush this time. We wrote a letter. Elise and I together. We kept it gentle, respectful, explained only what we knew. That we were daughters of Jane Caldwell. That we had only recently discovered her hidden past. That she had many years ago given birth to a daughter named Lydia. We sent it. And waited. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. Then, one morning, a simple email arrived. Subject: regarding your letter. It read, I think you might be right. But we should talk. Can we meet? She picked the place. A park just outside Columbus. A neutral, open space. Elise and I drove together, quiet and wide-eyed, trying not to build expectations we couldn't hold. We arrived early, sat on a bench near the playground. She found us. We knew it was her before she said a word. She was tall, wore a gray coat, moved like someone who'd spent a lifetime trying to stay unnoticed. But when she saw our faces, she stopped. Something in her crumbled. I always wondered, she said. I always felt untethered. Elise reached out first. I'm your sister, she said. So am I added. And then, for a moment, Lydia just stared at us like she was absorbing a different reality. I grew up knowing I was adopted, she said. My parents were kind, but secretive, especially about the early days. When I was 16, I found an old envelope in the attic. It said my original name was Baby Girl Caldwell. And you never searched? I asked. She shook her head. I was afraid of what I'd find, or what I wouldn't, but we sat in the park for hours. We told her everything. About the letter, the ribbon, Elise, Thomas, the photo of the mystery woman, the hospital record. Lydia pulled out a photo of her own, a Polaroid, cracked and fading. It was her, as a baby, in the arms of a young woman. The woman wasn't Margaret. Wasn't Elise. I stared at it. Eli said, Look. She squinted. That's the girl from the photo in the album. But Lydia nodded. My adoptive mother once told me that a young woman named Ellen held me for a moment before I left the hospital. She wasn't allowed to, but she did anyway. Said she was my aunt. But Ellen. That wasn't a name we knew. Or so I thought. But back home, I went digging. Through my mother's address books, her diaries, her half-kept Christmas card lists. And I found it. Ellen Caldwell. No mention of who she was. No phone number. Just a name, written once, in the corner of a recipe for strawberry pie. The handwriting was different. Jagged, I showed it to Elise and Lydia. Another sister, another aunt, we didn't know. But we would find out, because by now we understood the pattern. For every letter left behind, there was a name. For every name, a life. And for every life, a truth waiting to be uncovered. And somehow, we were the ones chosen to dig them up. We thought we were done chasing ghosts. After finding Thomas and Lydia, after holding our mother's secret children in our arms like reclaimed history, we believed the hardest parts were behind us. We were wrong, because the worst truths don't arrive screaming. They arrive quietly, one cracked photo, one scribbled name, one forgotten recipe card at a time. And they don't just change your past. They reach forward. They burn into everything that comes next. The name was Ellen Caldwell, a name we'd never heard in family stories, never seen on birthday cards or holiday lists. Just a quiet scrawl at the edge of a pie recipe, the last place anyone would think to look. And yet she'd held Lydia as a baby. Somehow she had access to the hospital. Somehow she was close enough to be trusted, and hidden enough to be erased. She might have been Mom's sister, Elise said, or maybe a cousin, or something else entirely, I replied, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just opened another door. One we weren't meant to touch. We started with records. Elise contacted a local genealogy group and pulled the full Caldwell family tree. It was full of holes, misfiled birth records, missing census lines, but one thread stood out. Margaret Caldwell had a second daughter, born 1956. No father listed. Name it Ellen Grace Caldwell. She would have been 7 years older than Jane. Elise stared at the screen. She would have been 24 when I was born. The same age Mom was when she gave birth to Lydia. The timeline fit too well. But why had our mother never mentioned her? Lydia, sitting beside us, scrolled through her phone. I can't find anything about her. No marriage license. No death record. Nothing after 1981. We searched everything. Old yearbooks, obituaries, hospital staff registries. Nothing. And then Thomas called. "You're not going to believe this," he said. We were on speaker, all three of us. Elise hit record without a word. I was going through the stuff Margaret gave me that day she visited the boys' home. You remember I told you she left a watch? Well, it was in a little wooden box. I never opened it since, but today I did. Pause. There was a letter inside. 1 page. Folded twice. It wasn't from her. Who was it from? Lydia asked. Ellen. Silence. He read it to us, slowly. Every word like a thud in the chest. If you ever find the others, tell them I'm sorry. I tried to protect your mother. I tried to stop what happened. But Margaret wouldn't listen. And Jane was too far gone. I left because I knew they would never forgive me. They called it love. It wasn't. There was no date, no signature. Just E scratched at the bottom. I felt cold all over. I think she was running, I whispered. Not just from the family, from something else. Elise looked up from her laptop. Guys, I just found something. An old news clipping from 1981, obscure local paper. It's about a fire at a boarding house in Vermont. One of the survivors was listed as Ellen Caldwell, 25, employee of Lakehurst Adoptions. That name again. Another link. We read the article together. A tragic fire. 2 lives lost. Ellen survived, taken to a nearby hospital. Released 2 days later. Then nothing. No follow-up, no interviews. But Lakehurst Adoptions, that was the agency involved with at least 2 of the known placements in our family tree. Do you think she worked there to keep track of the babies? Lydia asked. Or to keep them safe, Elise said. We looked again at the photo from Mom's album, the one with her and the unknown woman outside the hospital. We had assumed it was a friend, then a nurse, then Ellen. But now we saw something new. Her body language wasn't just protective, it was defensive. She wasn't standing with our mother. She was standing between her and something else. That's when I remembered something strange. She was wearing a lanyard. What? Elise turned to me. In the photo, around her neck. I always thought it was a necklace or an ID badge. But now I'm sure it was a badge. Look. We zoomed in. It was blurry, grainy old, but barely visible, printed above the badge clip, Lakehurst. She had worked there. Not just worked, been there that day. We had to go. The agency had long since shut down, but the building still existed. It had been turned into a municipal storage site, but part of the original foundation remained. We made the drive together. The receptionist was confused by our request, but eventually agreed to let us walk the lower floors. The carpet was ripped out. The walls stripped to concrete, but down a hallway labeled Archive. Elise stopped suddenly. They're carved faintly into the corner of a doorframe EGC, Ellen Grace Caldwell. She was here, Lydia whispered. She marked this place. And we opened the door. Inside was an old file cabinet, rusted shut. It took 10 minutes to pry open. But what was inside made us forget how to breathe. Dozens of folders, names, photographs, case notes, handwritten memos. None of it in any digital record, all of it real. And in the middle, a manila folder labeled Chiel Daguiel Incidenti. Internal notes. I opened it. Type summary. Subject Jane Caldwell. Mother, age 24. Infant girl unnamed, born March 19, 1980. Elder sibling previously adopted through St. Mary's. Third incident involving Margaret Caldwell. Staff conflict recorded, EGC. Submitted request to halt adoption, citing caution. Request denied. Below that, scribbled in blue ink, this is wrong. She doesn't want this. Margaret is forcing her. And under that, a line blacked out. Then, EGC. Placed on administrative leave following altercation with Margaret Caldwell in waiting room. No charges filed. Departure effective immediately. We stood there in that concrete room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, realizing we had just stumbled into something worse than abandonment, worse than silence. Our family hadn't just hidden things. It had broken people to keep those things hidden. Ellen tried to stop it. She failed. And she vanished. We left with copies of everything. Days passed in a blur. Lydia took time off work. Thomas drove down to join us. We met in Alyssa's bakery after hours, the lights low, the oven warm. A family of strangers made siblings by a mother too afraid to speak and an aunt who tried to protect us. And then, as if summoned by our search, the letter arrived. It came in an unmarked envelope, no return address, postmarked from Oregon. Inside, you found me. I've been watching. I'm glad you kept looking. If you want answers, real ones, come alone. Just you, Anna, 1570 Riverbend Road, March 10th, 3 p.m., no one else, no questions. It was her. She was alive, Ellen. And she wanted me? Why me? Why not Elise? Why not Lydia? Why now? I didn't know. But I packed my bag that night. Told no one where I was going. And I went. Because in a family built on silence, the only way to break it zero is to follow the one person who ran from it. I drove 12 hours straight through the mountains. By the time I crossed into Oregon, the sky had turned a bruised kind of blue, low clouds trailing across the highway like tired ghosts. I hadn't told Elise. I hadn't told Lydia or Thomas. I didn't tell anyone, because Ellen's letter had been clear. Come alone. No one else. No questions. Still, every mile that passed, every highway sign that ticked by, part of me wanted to turn back. There's something terrifying about meeting someone who knows everything you don't. Who's lived the story from the beginning while you've only ever read the middle chapters. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was this close. Riverbend Road was quiet. Dusty gravel. Pines lined both sides, swaying like they were trying to lean in and listen. The house at 1570 wasn't what I expected. A single-story cabin with faded shutters, a crooked mailbox, and flower beds full of dry soil and weeds. Not abandoned, but close. I parked in front, walked up to the door, knocked twice. It opened slowly, and there she was, Ellen. Older, thinner, her face drawn but sharp, her gray hair pulled into a messy braid. She wore a wool sweater and jeans, no shoes, no makeup. But her eyes, those same Caldwell eyes, were exactly as I imagined. Familiar, piercing. Sad. She looked at me without surprise. You came? Come. I nodded. Come. But the cabin was bare. A fireplace with a low flame, a worn couch, one table, a single photo frame on the mantel, turned face down. The air smelled like pine wood and old paper. You have questions? She said. I think you have answers, Dot. We sat. She poured tea without asking. It was strong and bitter. I didn't touch it. Ellen stared into the fire, then finally spoke. You know, Jane was my sister. I know now. She wasn't always the way you remember. When we were little, she laughed, loud. She was wild, impulsive. I adored her. Dot, what happened? She didn't answer right away. Margaret, she said finally. Or Mother. She wasn't just strict. She was cruel, but quiet about it. Her version of control was making you think you were the problem. Jane cracked under it. I bent. She broke. She paused. Jane got pregnant the first time when she was 16. Margaret didn't flinch. Just sent her away like she was a mistake to be corrected. You know that story already? Elise. She nodded. Yes, but it wasn't just Elise, and it wasn't just Jane. I held my breath. She did it to me too. 1974. I was 18. I stared. She told me the same thing she told Jana, that we'd ruined the family. That we were embarrassing. She said giving up the baby was the only way to fix it. What happened? I gave birth. They took her before I could hold her. Margaret paid the nurse to keep me sedated. I didn't know what to say. Spent the next 2 years trying to find her. I got a job at the adoption agency, Lakehurst, just to access the records. That's where I started seeing patterns. Babies taken from mothers who weren't actually consenting. Caution dressed as kindness. Threats masked as policy. I started documenting everything. She looked at me. Then came Jane's second pregnancy. Lydia, I whispered. She was different that time. She wanted to keep her. She begged Margaret. But our mother was relentless. She didn't scream. She arranged. By the time Jane gave birth, the adoption had already been finalized. Ellen stood, walked to the mantel, picked up the photo and handed it to me. It was Jane, holding a baby. She held her for 30 seconds before they took her. She never told us that. She couldn't. Margaret made sure of it. Told her if she ever tried to contact Lydia, they'd make sure she was declared mentally unfit. Said she'd never see another child again. My throat tightened. She broke your mother, Ellen said softly. And she blamed me for not stopping it the first time. But you tried. I did more than try. Ellen walked to the bookshelf and pulled down a black folder. Inside, copies of signed affidavits, memos, confidential complaints. You said you wanted truth, she said. Here's what really happened. There were documents proving that both Elise and Lydia's adoptions had been handled under legally questionable terms. Forms signed while sedated, witnesses coerced, nurses paid off. All roads led back to one name, Margaret Caldwell. She ran everything through Lakehurst, Ellen said. She had friends on the board, quiet donations, just enough power to manipulate from behind the curtain. And you? I blew the whistle. My eyes widened. In 1981, I took everything I had to a local reporter. That night, the agency's office caught fire. The boarding house fire, I said. She nodded. That wasn't an accident. They were cleaning house. And you disappeared? I had to. If they knew I survived, they would have finished the job. She sat again. I've lived in 6 states since. Changed my name 3 times. Never stayed in one place more than 5 years. Until now. Why now? She looked at me. Because you started digging. And because the last piece of this story wasn't mine to tell. I leaned forward. What do you mean? She took a breath. Your mother, she kept a diary. The only thing she never let go of. I've had it for years. I promised her I'd never open it. As she opened a drawer and pulled out a leather-bound book. The cover cracked. A ribbon tied it shut. I didn't want to read it. But after she died, I figured maybe she wanted it to be found. She handed it to me. I untied the ribbon, opened the first page. If someone is reading this, then I'm gone. And that means it's finally safe to tell the truth. The entries were long, full of grief, love, regret. She spoke of Elise, of being forced to let go, of Lydia, how Margaret manipulated her into compliance. But then came something new. Thomas. He hadn't been placed. He'd been hidden. By Ellen. Margaret didn't know. The entry read. Ellen took him, told the agency he'd died. She forged the paperwork. I knew I'd never see him, but at least he was safe. I looked at Ellen. You saved him. I tried. I failed too many times not to. I turned the final page, the last entry. It was dated 2 weeks before her death. There's one more. Ellen never knew. I never told her. I was so afraid of what it would mean, of what Margaret would do. But I want to believe she would have been kind. If I'd told her, if I'd kept her. Below that, a name. Nana. My breath left my body. Ellen froze. What? I turned the page. There was a birth certificate. My birth certificate. but not the one I'd always known. This one listed Jane Caldwell as my mother, and under father, a black line. No name? You weren't supposed to know? Ellen whispered. She gave birth to me. I was the last, the only one she kept, the one she lied to protect. My childhood, my house, my father, everything I thought I knew wasn't real. It was a story constructed from shame and survival. She raised me alone. Ellen nodded. After she left your stepfather, she moved back into Margaret's house. Claimed you were born later. She changed dates, erased names, made herself the aunt, not the mother. And Margaret, for once, stayed quiet. Maybe she knew she was dying. Maybe she was too tired to fight. I stared at the diary, my hands shaking. She never told me. She was trying to give you something she couldn't give the others, Ellen said gently. A clean slate, a life without the burden of secrets. But secrets don't disappear, I whispered. Wait. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the cabin, curled on the couch, staring at the fire as the truth reassembled my past piece by piece. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I returned home, called them all. Alice, Lydia, Thomas. Told them everything. We met at the bakery. I brought the diary. No one cried at first. We just sat, passing it from hand to hand, reading our mother's words out loud like scripture. When we finished, Elise said, "You're not our cousin?" "No," I said. "I'm your sister," but Thomas smiled. "Figures. You're the stubborn one?" Lydia took my hand. She gave us away. "But she chose you, not to favor, to protect." To her, and Elise added, "You're the reason this all came out." I laughed. "No. A letter hidden in a drawer started this." "No," she said. "You opened it." But that night, for the first time in months, we were together. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but wholly. The ribbon sat on the table between us. It had unraveled everything, and soon us back together. We were her children, all of us. And at last we had her truth, and it was ours to carry, not in silence, but in light. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and like the video.